Whenever I first read Carmen Maria Machado's short story, The Resident, the only thing my brain could think of was Continental Breakfast. Like, even though this short story is really intricate and awesome and uses and subverts horror tropes and Victorian tropes and all that stuff, literally the only thing my brain could think of was the Key and Peele sketch, Continental Breakfast. And so, which is kind of interesting because they have nothing to do with each other, like whatsoever. And, like all English graduate students, I was like, okay, I have to write this paper to connect these two things together. And so, one thing that actually does connect The Resident and Continental Breakfast is the main character. And these are main characters who, are kind of weird, don't really know if we should trust them and their judgment, things like that. And we can kind of connect like this unreliability of the narrator to Victorian tropes. And so that leads us to this essay. The unreliable narrator is somewhat difficult to categorize, mostly because of its original definition. Wayne C. Booth was the first scholar to define the unreliable narrator. I have called a narrator reliable when he speaks for or acts in accordance with the norms of the work, which is to say the implied author's norms. Unreliable when he does not. However, Ansgar Nunning finds this definition and those following it to be inadequate because it focuses on an entity, i.e., the implied author, that is poorly defined. As a result, Nunning believes that the idea of an unreliable narrator can be better defined as a projection by the reader who tries to resolve the ambiguities and textual inconsistencies by attributing them to the narrator's unreliability. Therefore, a narrator can become unreliable as the reader attempts to understand the inconsistencies in the text. So, a narrator's unreliability depends on the reader's judgment. Still, the reader does not question the narrator without reason. The reader might distinguish between textual signs such as internal inconsistencies and the verbal idiosyncrasies of the narrator, in contextual clues such as discrepancies between the world presented by a text and the reader's world knowledge and standards of normality. Another way to say it is that there is something queer about the narrator, and the reader is tasked with identifying what causes the narrator to be queer. In the short story The Resident, I think that Carmen Maria Machado creates a character who is queer, both in sexuality and personality, while making the reader question if the narrator is unreliable by using Victorian narration techniques and tropes. By using these elements, many of them rooted in misogyny, Machado causes the reader to question the narrator and her place in the narration as an active agent. Omitting information from realistic literary technique to obfuscation. As a practice, Victorian authors omitted place names, commonly stylized as -shire, to allow the reader to imagine that the plot is taking place anywhere, even in their own backyard. This was a common convention and did not cause the narrator to be considered unreliable. Instead, this added a realistic element to the work. However, as literature became more postmodern, which encourages the reader to question everything, including reality, this omission of information causes the reader to question the narrator. Nunning finds that, in addition to the inconsistencies of the narration, the reader can identify an unreliable narrator based on the norms, cultural models, and conceptual frameworks that readers bring to the text. And I believe that the cultural norms are what can transform these omissions from inserting reality into the text to inserting unreliability. In the modern world, omitting something is not viewed in a positive light, and people usually assume that this omission means that there is something that the person wants to hide. So when the narrator begins her story with, 2 months after receiving my acceptance letter to Devil's Throat, I kissed my wife goodbye. I left the city and drove north towards the Pea Mountains, where I had attended Girl Scout camp in my youth. readers may already be on their guard. The narrator does follow the conventional place name omission of the Victorian era by referring to the town as Y, while making sure to name the specific place where she will be staying, Devil's Throat. This mirrors the technique in many Victorian texts, where the reader will not know the name of the town, but will know the name of the specific house. Even though they are standard, I find these omissions to be strange, because the landscape is very specific, and the narrator is going to a place where most readers will never go, an artist colony. As a result, the omission of the names of the mountain range and town feels suspicious instead of freeing, because many readers, especially those from Louisiana, like me, cannot imagine a Devil's Throat in their community. So, I believe that this omission shows that the narrator wants to hide something, either from herself, from the reader, or from both. This seeming desire to hide something continues with the narrator's choice to omit certain names. The narrator chooses to omit her name, her wife's name, Mrs. Z's name, the Girl Scout's name, and the police officer's name, but chooses to disclose the names of the other residents. At first, I believe that this omission was because of the childhood trauma the narrator experienced as a girl, and I still think this is a reasonable theory. However, I think that the author omits these names because they are all introduced to her before her arrival to the resident colony. When the narrator arrives in her writing cabin, she reads the list of people who were there before her, and stops short when she reads her name. I frowned. Someone with my name, another resident, had occupied this cabin many years ago. I ran my finger over my name, over her name, and then rubbed it on my jeans. Instead of thinking more about this resident and the coincidence of it, the narrator promptly ponders on the term resident. The narrator rubbing her finger on her jeans seems to erase all thought of this connection, and is never brought up again. As a result, I believe that the narrator is avoiding this name because she senses a danger in it that threatens her consciousness and her understanding of her place. Instead of addressing the past resident with the same name and her omission of other character names, the narrator avoids the knowledge, causing her to be unreliable. However, being in the same area where she experienced her childhood trauma when she was at Girl Scout camp, the narrator can no longer avoid her knowledge and memory. And as these memories surface, the narrator seems to have no control over them. Sleepwalking in literature. Questioning authority. Early on during her stay at Devil's Throat, the narrator becomes ill. She notes, "I have been sick before, but never like this. I vomited so hard that I wrenched the toilet seat from its hinges with a terrible crack, and rested my head on the cool tile until it seemed clean, and the best of things." But afterwards she starts sleepwalking, which is a widespread literary trope during the Victorian era, especially with women. Zainab Ayub finds that sleepwalking highlights the instability and anxiety about many aspects of life, because Victorian people believed that the unconscious proper and the language of the repressed would be spoken vis-a-vis the medium of dreams, which, in this case, leads to sleepwalking. We can correlate the narrator's sleepwalking with repression. After her recovery, the narrator remembers that, "I had once been sick at camp. How had I forgotten? I remembered one of the leaders taking my temperature and clucking her tongue at the number. I remembered a sense of despair." While it is not clear that she repressed this memory of camp, this repression does adhere to what the reader can glean from the narrator so far. And the reader learns of the narrator sleepwalking suddenly in the middle of the story. She woke up to moaning. "I was standing at the base of the stairs, barefoot and in my pajamas. I had not sleepwalked in years, yet here I was, upright and elsewhere." Right before she starts sleepwalking, the narrator talks with another resident, Diego, who refers to them as colonists, which horrifies her. As a result, the reader is led to believe that these events are connected, but later learns that sleepwalking and illness are connected by her traumatic experience at camp. This revival of the narrator's sleepwalking emphasizes the Victorian ideas of sleepwalking and repression because the narrator had forgotten about this event. This also introduces a postmodern view of the condition that questions place and reality. Victorian thinkers were not the only ones who questioned dreams, sleepwalking, and their connection to reality. However, instead of attempting to find connections between dreams, sleepwalking, and repression, other philosophers used these elements to question the idea of identity. Zhangji, a Taoist philosopher of the 4th century BCE, dreamed that he was a butterfly, and in his account, he does not make a clear distinction or divide between his dream self, the butterfly, and his worldly self, the human. Peter Schwenger believes that Zhangji's story sparked the awareness of the strange division between different forms of life to be replaced by an awareness of how difficult it is to establish the difference between waking and dreaming states. In essence, many times we cannot distinguish dreams from reality, and these dreams can bleed into our everyday lives. And being aware of this phenomenon can drastically alter our view of reality. Schwenger emphasizes this liminal space, reminding readers that, even at the time we are having an experience, we can hardly be aware of all the connections that have been brought into play to make it happen. Therefore, sleepwalking can be defined as more than repressions presenting themselves or general anxieties, especially in a postmodern world. Characters can be sleepwalking without knowing it, so in theory, they can believe that they are living an experience that does not really exist. I think that sleepwalking is an interesting literary technique to consider with characters. The idea that the dream world and reality converge can make the reader question the character in general because, technically, the character is a product of the author's imagination. Many authors say in interviews that characters have a mind of their own. But since the characters are not in our reality, we cannot know whether or not this is true. Therefore, sleepwalking can insert instability and unreliability in the text. Machado inserts this instability of identity in place through sleepwalking. The narrator recalls the aftermath of her sleepwalking incident at camp. The next morning, the leaders told me I sleepwalked deep into the woods. They let me rest, and when I woke again, a fever had taken me. My awakening had been so severe, it provoked in my body an immune reaction, a summoning of antibodies that clashes with this new information like armies on a medieval battlefield. I woke up with long scratches down my arms. The tree branches? My own fingernails? No one would tell me. We learned that this event was orchestrated by the other girls in the cabin as revenge for the narrator kissing Mrs. Z's daughter. The narrator asks, how could I have known that they had guided my trusting sleepwalking body out of the cabin and through the forest? She then comes to understand that in that moment, I was a creature so small, trapped in some crevice of an indifferent universe. I believe that this statement describes the narrator's place in the narrative. The narrator is trapped in a narrative where she does not have control, which is reflected in her sleepwalking, and is instead being guided by an authorial presence. The narrator remembers sharing with my peers a list of interesting facts I've memorized. Most white dogs are deaf. You should never wake sleepwalkers, but you may be able to gently guide their sleeping forms to bed. Cashews are related to poison ivy. So, the readers learn that one should not wake a sleepwalker, and they can't control the sleepwalker's motions. I think this is an apt way to view characters because the author has the final say in what they do. So the sleepwalking introduces a more powerful authority than the narrator. This authority wants to avoid thinking about the life before Devil's Throat, so I believe that this entity is the author at Devil's Throat with the narrator's name. Implied author. Who is really in control? The narrator's actions imply an authorial figure throughout the story. When she arrives at Devil's Throat, she seems to lose whatever authority she had on her journey there. After checking in, back in the foyer, Benjamin was standing among all of my things, my suitcases, my hamper, even my car's emergency supply backpack, which was not supposed to leave my trunk. "Did I leave my car unlocked?" I said. "Why would you lock it here?" he asked cheerfully. "Here you go." He bent down and lifted my suitcases. The author does not have control over who touches her belongings, and she cannot even remember if she locked her car. And it is even implied that locking an automobile at Devil's Throat is completely unnecessary. In fiction, the author usually determines this. And the longer that the narrator is at Devil's Throat, the less power she seems to have. She has boils or some other type of skin abscess that pop up on her skin unexpectedly, and she does not have a way to stop them or an explanation. However, the biggest clue that there is an outside force acting on the sleepwalking narrator is her response to Lydia calling her crazy towards the end of the short story. At the end of the retort, the narrator yells, "You may think that I have an obligation to you, but I assure you that us being thrown together in this arbitrary arrangement does not cohesion make. I have never had less of an obligation to anyone in my life, you aggressively ordinary woman." Before this encounter, the narrator is characterized by intense anxiety. She worries about where she parks her car and is self-conscious of the number of belongings that she brings with her, showing that she is concerned about her first impression at the artist colony, pointing to social anxiety. We get inklings that the social anxiety started at a young age when the narrator recounts certain events from Girl Scout camp, such as when she recites random fun facts at the fire. While she does talk with the residents and tell them about her time as a Girl Scout at the first dinner, with the assistance of alcohol, she does not converse too often with the other residents, and she does not share much about herself. So her response to Lydia feels completely out of character. Even though she is a writer, I do not think that certain phrases in her response would occur organically, such as the phrase, "This arbitrary arrangement does not cohesion make," especially since this is a stressful situation. Instead, this response sounds orchestrated and revised, leading us to an authorial figure, and this causes us to question who is actually unreliable, the narrator or this authorial figure. Based on the information that we have about the narrator, I believe that we can classify her as an unreliable narrator due to her faulty memory or limited knowledge. Also, keeping her sleepwalking in mind, we can safely conclude that her unreliability is based on both of these elements. However, the narrator is not unreliable by choice. She is unreliable because the author dictates it. As a result, this takes away authority from the characters, who can be trapped in the narrative. In the Key and Peele sketch, Continental Breakfast, the main character checks into a hotel where they serve a complimentary continental breakfast. He eats the breakfast and is absolutely enthralled by it. So he decides that he will be staying indefinitely. The receptionist replies, "But sir, don't you know that you've always been here?" And the scene pans to a picture of the main character at a continental breakfast in 1935. I mention this work specifically because the main character has no control and is not even aware that he had been at the same hotel for decades. We see him arrive at the hotel, but we never see him leave, and we know very little about him. I think that the main character in Continental Breakfast and the narrator and the resident are similar in the ways that they are treated by the people around them, i.e., as crazy people who should be ignored or appeased within reason, and that they are unaware of their place in the narrative or their ability to enact change in their lives. In both works, the characters' actions and personalities are dictated by an authorial figure and they can never escape it. In Continental Breakfast, we really only see what is presented to us without any input from the authorial figure, and the main character seems really happy. But in The Resident, I believe that there are places in the narrative where the implied author inserts herself, consciously or unconsciously, into the narrative. Discussing her novel with Lydia, the narrator declares that her protagonist isn't batty or mad, but instead, she is me, more or less. She's just in her head a lot. I believe this is an example of the implied author revealing herself because she is doing the same thing in her own writing as her narrator. The only difference is that the implied author is using her own name for the main character. Since the narrator is a fictionalized version of the implied author, why else would she have the perfect response to Lydia? Then we can see the narrator's internal thoughts as another way that the implied author inserts herself into the story. Walking through the forest, blanketed in a dense fog, the narrator tells herself, "You are a fool. You have been reading too much, and your mind is wound too tightly. You have been drowning in memory. Your wife. She would be embarrassed for you if she knew that you had drifted this far." These thoughts perfectly fit the personality of the narrator, so the reader would not reconsider the source. However, I think there is an added layer to this internal monologue when we consider that the implied author most probably walked through the same area and had similar, if not the same, thoughts and reactions during her walk. Because of the close nature between the implied author and her protagonist, it is incredibly difficult to ignore these moments where it seems like the author is revealing herself and her role in the text. While we do not know if the narrator is aware of the implied author or to what degree, the narrator does address the outside control on her actions. Of course, she is somewhat accustomed to not having complete control as a sleepwalker, but she takes a similar view to her writing. After a productive day of writing, the narrator imagines her interviews with famous interviewers. She plans to describe her writing process as feeling like I'm being hypnotized. This is, technically, an apt description because the implied author is the one who is really writing about Lucy's adventures, but attributing it to the narrator's work.
Advocating to the reader.
Interestingly, even though the author inserts herself in the narrative, she still emphasizes the narrator's unreliability by having the narrator address the reader. Now, this is also a Victorian technique, and a well-known example of this is at the end of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. "Reader, I married him." However, addressing the reader is another sign of an unreliable narrator. Nunning states, "The stylistic signals of unreliability can thus be further differentiated in terms of the linguistic expressions of subjectivity." Addressing the reader inserts subjectivity, especially when narrators implore the reader to make a decision on their trustworthiness. This indicates a high degree of emotional involvement, and they provide clues to an unreliable narrator's problematic value scheme. The narrator only addresses the reader after she leaves Devil's Throat, and may or may not have returned with her wife, who also remains nameless for the story. She declares, "I know what you're thinking, reader. You're thinking, does this woman have the temperament to come to our residency, having failed so thoroughly at this one? Surely she is too fragile, too sick, too mad to eat and sleep and work among other artists." This statement implores the reader to have sympathy for the narrator and to rule in her favor, which is emphasized by this next question. Thus far in your jury deliberations, have you encountered any others who have truly met themselves? Instead of showing the reader a life after her residency, the narrator turns her attention to the reader. So I believe that the narrator can continuously arrive at the artist colony, but she can never truly leave. And the narrator cannot leave the artist colony because the implied author limits her motions and keeps her in place where the implied author can work through whatever she wants to hide. The narrator of The Resident inspires many questions, but some of the more important ones are, what is the narrator leaving out? And can I trust her? Of course, Machado could be challenging her readers and their preconceived notions of female characters and of how the narrator should be, while also challenging the ways in which many of us treat those who we consider crazy, ignore them, and pray that they leave us alone. However, I think that Machado is experimenting with postmodern literature and the questions surrounding the place of the author in a work, especially regarding the unreliable narrator. The implied author intends for her narrator to be unreliable and uses techniques to show the reader the inconsistencies in the narration. Therefore, I believe that Machado is emphasizing this idea in the short story, which reminds readers of the authority of the author and how layered literature is when considering authorship and the limited authority of characters. I think that Booth's original definition of an unreliable narrator works in our postmodern world because of how vague it is, allowing for multiple interpretations. His definition allows us to question which author's norms we are using to judge the narrator to determine who is really unreliable. Hey y'all, I hope you enjoyed watching the video. If you enjoyed learning about Carmen Maria Machado's short story, The Resident, and want to check out some of her other ones, this is her short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties. She also has a memoir, In the Dream House, and which also kind of touches on metafiction, which is kind of interesting. So those are some really great works, and I suggest that y'all read them or check them out or whatever. If you enjoyed watching this video, please like and subscribe so that you will see my videos every single week. Bye!